Thank you very much, Bob. I guess don't need to introduce myself. I was just introduced. I just want to tell Bob, though, I'm kind of at a loss because he's stolen my lines. So what am I going to say? So as Bob described, I've spent a lot of the last 2 years working with neighbors, friends in our community to raise awareness of the proposed Gateway Pacific Terminal, which is just across the border to your south. And I want to provide just some experiences from what we've done in the last 2 years in a way that I think applies very directly to your issue here. When an applicant proposes an activity like a coal terminal, they describe it as this thing, sorry about that, which is within the boundaries of some property that they own or they're authorized to use. And they say, hey, it's our place. Don't you worry about what we do on our place. And what is true about these proposals, but not brought forward by the proponents, is the entire scale of the activity. So you heard it described a bit, but it's important to visualize what's intended here. The coal is to be dug up from Wyoming and Montana in the United States, shipped over 1,000 miles by rail. Your proposed terminal involves 2 transshipments of the coal, right? 2 loadings, long ocean voyage to China, and there that coal is burned, and we will all get it back. All right? So when you take on this issue and assess it, a core question is, what do you look at? Do you look just inside the fence line, or do you look at the entire project? Now, our site is entirely what's called unimproved, and that is the true land use definition of it. Here it is, Cherry Point unimproved, and in order to load the coal, it has to be improved. Now, the Fraser Surrey Docks is an existing port, so in its entirety, it's not technically unimproved exactly. However, you will get to see this type of improvement coming your way. To decide whether this will be allowed, in any jurisdiction there is some version of a permit process. Bob described what you have in your case, and we have in the United States a more extensive process. We have extra process steps. But the most important thing I want to tell you tonight is that this is not what drives decisions, because the entire process is that official process plus how it relates to the community. We had our opportunities to do public comments prescribed by our process, and we turned that into a community conversation about the terminal. And we did it through the agencies they gave us these meetings to have. We had as many as 2,000 people show up at these meetings. But if you have less overt process, you do not need anyone's permission to have that community conversation. And we ran a kind of a controlled experiment, which is very revealing about this question. This amount of process we have, how much does it matter? Right? We have more in the US, you have less in Canada. And we have some pretty compelling information that it doesn't matter much. And the reason is 3 agencies participated in the United States. They participated in the exact same process. They received the exact same comments, 124,000 of them. They listened to the exact same public comments. And one of the agencies came to a wildly different conclusion about the scope of the inquiry. So the difference was not process. The difference was the environment in which those agencies operate. The Corps of Engineers operated in an environment, mostly back in Washington, D.C., the kind of big money, big power environment. They made certain decisions that were not very favorable, very limited scope. The state of Washington made very different decisions because they live in an environment of the government recently elected, and many of the people are so active in Washington for protecting our environment. And so as you consider your process, options that may seem limited at times, you want to recognize they decide in an environment that is around them, and that environment It's you. A key concept of United States EIS's environmental impact assessment is the scope of inquiry. Now, you may not have this regulatory term, but it's a key idea no matter what. Scope is simply what should be considered when making a decision about the port. And you can measure it in the dimension of what impacts should be considered times what locations should be considered. And as you consider that scope, you consider the adverse impacts which could result from the terminal. And you've heard about some of them. You'll get a little more detail on particular ones from Dr. James, but there's 5 main categories of impacts. You have the mining of the coal itself, destroys water resources, causes other issues. Transit, which includes emissions, includes things like risks of collision. People get killed by these trains and walked emergency vehicles. You have the operations of the terminal itself that Phil showed you some really revealing pictures of, including things like pollutants going into the river or the sea. And you have marine impacts. Once the coal is loaded on the ships, what types of impacts do you then have, including one of the biggies, which is risk of collision and ships sinking. Now, for those who can count beyond 4, you may have noticed I said 5 major types of impacts. The combustion of the end product is the 5th major type of impact. And often this is described in terms of global warming. And that's certainly a very big concern. It's a very motivating concern for me. But it's bigger than that because those combustion products are things that harm life expectancies in China. Northern China, they've done studies. Coal emissions have shortened lives in certain areas by up to 5.5 years. So, if you have family in China, if you know anybody who has family in China, I guarantee you do, that's a real concern. There's emissions of mercury that comes back, and of course, the global warming pollutants as well. So in a larger sense, this is by tonnage and by total impact the biggest one, although it may seem farther away at times. Okay? Sorry about the timing. The auto time should be switched off. We have a key term called significant. It's things that the agencies will consider. You have to demonstrate that a particular impact matters, either in scale or severity, or how many people or how many resources will be affected by that impact. And as you describe the significance of your impact, there are various things you can do. And when I say you, I mean you in any setting. Your opportunity to comment in writing, comment in person, otherwise show your concern about proposals like that. Adding to significance is first the word sensitive, which describes that, hey, if something was happening in, let's say, some industrial area where nobody in their ordinary life would be exposed, you might be less concerned. But a sensitive receptor is a term that's someone harmed by an impact, such as schools. You may have a resource that's highly valued, such as the Salish Sea, the fishing and tourism resources, and ultimately resources that are irreplaceable. So these are all ideas that you can summon when you have your opportunity to describe to a decision maker why an impact is significant. We have an example. It's down in Bellingham, but I've been to Crescent Beach. It's very similar and a really wonderful setting, and boy, it's a match. And you can see the red line shows the rail lines going right through between the park and the rest of town. There's the potential that we'll lose all vehicle access and all emergency vehicle access to Boulevard Park. Situation very similar to what you'd face in areas from White Rock up through Crescent Beach. But as you look at these things, I want to urge you to really understand a given impact, because this is not Boulevard Park, right? This is a map. This is Boulevard Park. All of these places are places where we've been conditioned to accept a gradual deterioration in their original state, and we've been taught to no longer think of these places as being in any way sacred. And in fact, if you catch Bob later, he was telling me this fantastic story of rail execs saying, well, what did you expect living next to a railroad track? That exec blissfully ignorant of the fact that some of those people had lived there before the railroad track. Another key concept to help establish significance of an impact is the permanent change of places like this to this. Now, I want to give you a working definition of permanence. Permanence is as long as you live, and as long as anyone you ever meet lives. Certain places that are now in a either natural state or a less degraded state will be permanently impacted, permanently either degraded or rendered lifeless. Let's look at another type of permanence, which is the reduction in places where animal life or life can be. And the example I want to give you is the Cherry Point herring. And we have some time-lapse maps here, 1973 to 80, 1970s. The herring were doing pretty well. You see these maps that the big dot is like 1,000 herrings spawning each spring, or tons of herring spawning each spring. The West Shore Terminal is just off the map to the top left. So let's track what happened over time to the herring. Now this is not just due to the coal terminal, it's other impacts like refineries, but this is the sequence of events that happened after that terminal was installed and expanded operation, and other impacts came in at the same time. Here's the 80s. Okay, so here, let's go back to 70s for a minute. There's 70s, 80s, 90s, last census that we have. Okay, so, and this is a key species of fish that the salmon eat. The salmon, in turn, are eaten by the orcas. The orcas are well, what can you say about the orcas, other than we certainly don't want them to go? So, in the case of Cherry Point, this is particularly ironic because, now, if you had absolutely no sense of irony, and you just imagined at random where you would want to put North America's largest coal terminal, where do you think it would be proposed? So in our terminal, our proposed terminal in the US, the fate of the herring is a huge, huge concern. And I regret that I don't have specific information about species that you might be concerned about closer to Fraser's Surrey docks, except I can just guarantee you one thing, they're there. We went through a process of training people really quickly to comment in these hearings that we had, and I want to be really clear, you don't need permission to provide your comments in any setting. You can make the events, you can decide that you want to be heard. It's a real basic format. You say, identify the impact that you care most about, assemble your reasons that it's significant, use those concepts like permanence and sensitivity, and then ask for something. Always, always ask. Don't just rant. If you have the opportunity to communicate, don't say, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad. No. Always, always ask. Really important reason is, one is they might just do it, the thing you're asking for. But secondly, anytime someone's listening to you, they're hearing about your impacts, if you ask them for something, they gotta stop and think about it. One extra step, because they have to decide whether they're going to do that thing you were asking for. So a really key, really effective thing is to ask for something, and you might be the one of you will be, the one who asks the question of a decision maker that brings the moment of clarity. That person that he may not have realized until that moment, this is wrong. That's the thing that we trained several thousand commenters over on our side of the border to do in connection with our coal terminal. It's the very simplest structure that we could use to arm people, do a little bit of focused research on one topic they cared about, and deliver their best possible input to the agencies. A couple other key things about your comments. If you do have an impact you're concerned about, you do have to comment about something that is reasonably foreseeable. This again is a US term, but it applies. You can't make stuff up. So here's an example. The West Shore Terminal had a freak dust event freak wind event. And you see the result there, because nobody could possibly have foreseen that on the Pacific coast it would be windy. So do comment on things that are reasonably foreseeable. Another topic is, can it be mitigated? You may receive assurances, oh, we've taken care of that dust thing, right? We sprayed that gummy stuff on it, right? Mitigation is never 100% effective, right? That spray, it's 85% effective, right? Which means 15% what? Ineffective or something, right? I always feel really assured when I eat my breakfast cereal in the morning, it is 85% coal-free. Right? So all this adds up to, what's really going to change things? One or more impacts that people come to understand are, it's an adverse impact that's reasonably foreseeable, it's significant, and it will not be mitigated in the proposed plan. You can comment about any and all, many hundreds or thousands of different things, but these are the game changers. This is the thing that everyone is looking for. Because when these agencies make these decisions, they won't decide based on whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. Because bad ideas get permitted all the time. Right? There's no law that says you can't do something that's a bad idea. It's a much higher bar than that. The true bar is, can it be done in good conscience? Or is it unconscionable? So, if your intent is to stop this coal terminal or any of the other coal terminal expansions, you got to aim high, because your goal is to demonstrate through showing impacts that are reasonable, foreseeable, and significant, and will not be mitigated, that the project is unconscionable. So you'll have a window of opportunity to contribute to this. And remember that model? Describe your impacts, have an ask, right? And hopefully create that moment of clarity. So I better have my ask too, right? The significance to this, to me in a larger sense, beyond all these impacts, is we have the opportunity to turn away from the combustopalooza. Combustopalooza is the frenzy of finding and lighting on fire absolutely everything you can find, right? We have a milestone opportunity to do it. That's the significance for me. The two biggest moments in human history, and you're one of them, right? The first one was when we discovered how to light things on fire. It was a big moment, right? Okay, you could have cookouts. It was very special. The second moment in human history is when we decided not to light so many things on fire. So in accordance with that, I want to ask you to bring your concerns to your neighbors, to people you think may be decision makers, to friends, to people who will soon be your friends, and bring them awareness of these issues. Thanks very much for the opportunity to be here. And,